Now, although this short video series is in your novel unit, it's important that you understand that archetypes do appear throughout all types of literature, and so we're going to see them in poems. You might see them in epics or in mythology. In fact, quite a few of our archetypes come from mythology because the idea of the archetype is that it has, been around and been a part of the human psyche, almost from inception. And so you should expect and you should begin to look for these in really any place that you're reading stories. They're found in wisdom literature, they're found in religious traditions, and they're found in fairy tales. So everywhere we look at literature, we're going to be looking at archetypes. So in addition to your explanation of archetypes in the course content, just as a broad overview, we need to understand that an archetype is a universal pattern that appears in, as I mentioned, mythology, literature, religious traditions, fairy tales, okay, all of those areas. And they occur in all cultures and periods. They are not limited just to Western culture. One example of that would be the idea of the Cinderella story with the young girl who has lost her mother and a stepmother comes in with daughters of her own, and that basic story structure and several of the elements of the plot of the Cinderella story occur in cultures all around the world and seemed to spring up independently of each other. You can find similar stories occurring in cultures in time periods when those cultures would not have had interaction. So it's not that they shared the story occurred independently. And so that's what gives rise to this idea that these are certain ideas or patterns that are a part of the human psychology. And the idea of archetypes really originated in the study of psychology, not in the study of literature. Now, an archetype can be many things, and we're going to talk about just a few of those in your class here this year. One important and probably the most common way that you see the archetype appear is in a character type. And the epic hero is the one that we see most frequently, but you will see other character types as well. And once you are aware of them, you'll find that you're able to more readily spot them. There are also certain plot patterns, and if you are a fan of anything in the science fiction or fantasy genre, you will recognize this pattern when we go into it. Everything from Star Wars to Harry Potter to the Rick Riordan's series with Percy Jackson, and all of that follows the hero's journey pattern. There are also settings that have special meaning and fall into this idea of archetypes. There are certain symbols and motifs that if you are aware of them and recognize them, you'll realize fit into the archetype mode. And there can be themes or ideas for stories that fall into the archetypes. And I'm going to talk about that for just a minute because we won't do much with it later on. But the idea of a repeating theme is really thinking, if you think about any Disney movie, most of the themes of the Disney movies fit into an archetypal theme. The idea that the outsider can find his or her place in society, or that beauty is only skin deep. And so in Beauty and the Beast, we find out that the Beast is actually a better person than Gaston, the traditionally handsome person. And so many of those ideas that you see coming up over and over again are universal or archetypal themes. Okay, but what we want to get into first of all, because there are so many of them to cover, are the character archetypes that you will find appearing throughout literature. And again, as I said, these could be fairy tales, wisdom literature, and once you recognize them, you'll find yourself even pulling them out of movies. Whether you want to or not, they're going to be there and you'll be noticing them. So let's start with some of the female archetypes. And we have three different mother figure possibilities in the idea of the archetypes. We have the fairy godmother or the surrogate mother. This is the person who might raise the abandoned child, or steps in if the child's own parents or own mother is not very loving or helpful. They can comfort and give direction to the child. And sometimes the fairy godmother will have powers that the child can call upon for help, or that someone can come back to and call upon for help. And so that's a positive mother figure. Then we have the Earth Mother, which primarily is positive, although it can be also a very powerful destructive force. But the Earth Mother is that embodiment of the idea of spirituality and the nourishment that we get from the earth, the idea of the abundance of things, and brings about the ideas of fertility, of rebirth and regrowth and continuing the species. And then we have the negative mother figure, the stepmother, who is jealous, is manipulative, is sort of the antithesis of what the fairy godmother would be. It's going to do all of the opposite, and you'll see that there can be some overlap of these archetypes as well. As we look at the other female figures, you see that we have the idea of the temptress. This is going to be a negative female figure. She is beautiful and sensuous, but she is also dangerous because she's going to bring about the downfall of the hero. She knows how to use her power, whether that be her beauty or her intellect or her sexuality, to typically against the hero of the story. And she is wily enough to use the male's own desires against him. And throughout history, we've had many examples of this temptress figure. In Greek mythology, we had the sirens, and that's the photo that you have here on the page. The sirens singing their song to lure the sailors to their death. Even as looking at wisdom literature with the Bible, we have Eve as the kind of almost the original temptress, tempting Adam to eat the apple, and then the fall from grace. And in a more contemporary example, if you are familiar with or aware of the television series from the late 1990s, early 2000, called Buffy the Vampire Slayer, we had a character there named Faith, who was definitely a temptress sort of figure. She not only would tempt men, but she was also tempting the female heroine by trying to bring the female heroine to abandon her sense of responsibility and to give in to her violence and her power and those sorts of ideas. All right, another negative female figure is the idea of the witch, and sometimes this overlaps with the stepmother. If you think of like Sleeping Beauty and some of those fairy tales, the witch is a woman who attempts to trap and destroy the hero. Can also be a temptress, or as I said before, can be a stepmother. And we have a really great example of the witch in Macbeth. In fact, the whole story, begins with the three hags, or the three witches, who have this prophecy, and they use that prophecy to trap Macbeth, because once they've made him aware that he might be king, he begins to take actions to become king, and those actions are what bring about his downfall. Now, some other archetypal characters can be either male or female. We have the idea of the teacher, whom you might also see called the mentor or a sage. This would be a wise person who typically tends to guide the hero on the hero's quest or journey, and does this by providing maybe skills or shares knowledge that the hero needs, or sometimes it can be a talisman, an amulet, or something like that the hero is going to need to complete this quest. And throughout literature, we have Dumbledore, as in the picture here from the Harry Potter series. We have Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars series. Yoda would also be an example of a sage from that series. From Lord of the Rings, we have Gandalf. And in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, we have Giles, the adult librarian watcher, who is meant to be her guardian and teacher. All right, you might find that you have an outcast or a loner that is one of your characters. This person is separated from society in some way, physically, emotionally, maybe there's a psychological difference. The loner might then also become a hero. That is a possibility. Or the loner outcast might become someone who works against your hero. In Lord of the Flies, we saw Piggy as this outcast character, and we saw that he was also a helper to our hero, Ralph. In Buffy the Vampire Slayer, we have Xander, who is a bit of an outcast because he's not as smart, not as handsome, not athletic, and doesn't fit into what society thinks of as cool. In the Harry Potter series, I think Luna Lovegood would be a good example of this loner or outcast. We know that other people pick on her and they hide her things, and yet she does have value that she can bring to the hero's quest. Okay, a third archetype that you might encounter is the innocent. And this might be a true child, or this might be a young person, or even an adult who just continues to see the world as being good, has trust and optimism, and really doesn't acknowledge the evil in the world. From the novel of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, we might argue that that Lenny is an innocent throughout. So they tend to be a danger at times to themselves and to others because they don't see the weaknesses in others, or they don't see the dangers around them. And it is possible at times that they will be too dependent on others. In the Lord of the Rings cycle, Frodo begins very much as an innocent and doesn't always see the dangers around him, and it's up to Samwise to really be his stabilizer and the person who points out that not everyone is as good as they appear and that there are dangers in things. In the Buffy the Vampire series, we had Willow, who for many seasons was an innocent, and she eventually loses that, but she begins as having this great trust in people and in their in their basic fundamental goodness of things.